What if the secret to living a longer, healthier, and happier life isn't in a prescription or a self help book, but actually in your passport? In this episode, you'll learn what this doctor turned preventative health advocate says his number one piece of advice is for lifelong health. It just might surprise you. Hey everyone, happy June and kick off to summer. I know so many of us are about to embark on our summer travels or winter travels if you're down in the Southern Hemisphere. Whether it's camping in your own state or heading off around the world, I wish you all of the safe, happy, and healthy travels as possible. In this episode, you'll discover how you can completely change the way you live, age, and thrive by applying Dr. Wolk's 9 pillars of lifelong health. Why focusing on your health span rather than just your lifespan can be the real key to lasting happiness, and how booking your next trip can be just as important for your longevity as your next doctor's visit. I have Dr. Eric Wolk of Jetset Meds on the pod today discussing the power of travel on your health, happiness, and longevity. Dr. Wolk brings over 15 years experience as a board-certified medicine specialist, having worked over a decade in the emergency department to now working as a preventative care specialist in his concierge practice. Dr. Wolk's seen the power of applying preventative health principles to his patients' lives and how surprisingly travel plays a key role in the quality of health and life. Dr. Wolk's also the founder of Jetset Meds, which is an innovative travel health platform born from his firsthand experience treating travelers in distress, which we're going to talk more about in this episode. Jetset Meds offers physician-curated medical kits for travelers, ensuring access to essential, safe, and effective medications while abroad. I don't know about you, but I have been in some sketchy urgent care centers around the world, and I sure could have used a Jetset Meds kit many, many times. By the way, use code TRANSFORM10 for 10% off your order when you rush to their website to check them out. So with all that said, today's episode has come at the perfect time as we head off on our summer or our winter adventures, depending on where in the world you are. And this is actually a part 1 of a 2-part episode, which will air next week. So stay tuned for that. And before we begin, after all of that, as a reminder, the information shared in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. So as always, consult with a qualified healthcare professional before making any changes. All right, I am so stoked for you to listen to this podcast and learn from Dr. Wolk. Let's go. Hello, hello. Welcome to the Transform with Travel podcast. I'm Kelly Tolliday, and I'm joined today by Dr. Eric Wolk, who's the founder of Jetset Meds. And today we are going to dive deep into 2 of my favorite topics, travel and health. And more importantly, we're going to be talking about the intersection of the 2 together. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, Kelly, thank you so much for having me.
We got connected a little bit ago through my travel agency, right? Because you had created this amazing product, Jetset Meds, which we're going to get into in a little bit. And we got on a call and we were like, wait, we have so many common values and common interests and travel styles. And we knew immediately that, at least I knew that I needed to get you on the podcast so that my community can hear from you. And I know a lot of our community is very interested in wellness, very interested in health, and also obviously interested in travel, the name of the podcast. Mm-hmm. So it's really awesome to see someone like yourself who has had such a long and fascinating career treating over 60,000 patients, working with rock stars and CEOs, and to see you pioneering a new approach to this travel health industry or sector. And you also have a lot of personal experience of travel and adventure yourself. I'd love to hear from you, kind of taking us back to that moment where you realize that travel and medicine need to intersect in a new way, and kind of like what was created out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. So I've been a board certified emergency medicine doctor for 20 years now. Gosh, that kind of flew by. And early on, my wife and I decided that travel was going to be a big part of our lives. And even back to, I remember we went to college together, we went to Cornell together, and just as soon as we finished college, even when I was in first year medical school, like it was obvious that we were going to be taking as many trips as we possibly could. And after graduating medical school, finishing residency, we went on a trip to Tortola, and we had our fair share of incidences, but we went on a trip to Tortola, and I'm a surfer like you are, as you know. And as soon as we got off the plane, there was like a half hour of sunlight left. Actually, it was a plane to a boat, to the boat to the island. There was a half hour of sunlight left. And I was like, I dragged her out to the beach for like a quick dip, last minute surf maybe before the sunset. And we were walking along the beach. It was dark at this point, and she's a tough cookie. She's like 5'3" and 95 pounds, but she is like as tough as they come. And she was like, I just stepped on something and it's killing me. So as soon as we got back to a little bit of light, I look in her foot, and I thought she just stepped on a shell. So I look in her foot, and there is like a full-on triangular shaped foreign body with a tail hanging off it. And I was like, oh, wow, you didn't just step on a rock. And so this was like pre-ChatGPT. Google existed, but it wasn't what it is today. And so I looked at it, and I realized it was the tail of a scorpion. So she had essentially stepped on a scorpion because I made her walk on the beach at night. And scorpion stings can be pretty serious, actually. And back then, I was 1 or 2 years out of residency. I totally traveled with a medical pack of sorts, but I didn't have exactly what we needed for a scorpion sting. And we had just landed. So it turned into like a 5-day journey of trying to find a doctor who I could communicate with, who had what we needed. And ultimately, and there's no Uber, this woman, I'll never forget, this woman showed up with like her taxi, which was like a 1950s Cadillac. My wife's leg is like hanging out the window. We go to like the clinic, and truthfully, at this point, it looked so bad that if we were in the States and she came to my hospital, I probably would have admitted her to the intensive care unit overnight. I'm not even exaggerating.
Wow.
For like heavy duty IV antibiotics. Fortunately, we were able to get a hold of some antibiotics, but it was, to say the least, it was a bit of a trip ruiner. And the truth is, like, if I had the correct antibiotics and EpiPen and probably 1 or 2 other things, we probably could have just treated her in the room. And nowadays with telemed and chat and video and AI, that could have been a much less stressful situation. And that was when it first started clicking for me, like, A, I need to be traveling with a fairly extensive pharmacy. And B, as we moved along and as technology kind of improved and communication improved across borders and things like that, I then kind of transitioned to my concierge business. And that was when I realized that my patients deserve that same level of care. And really, in order to do that, it felt as though we had to make sure people were traveling with a fairly robust, although judicious selection of medications. And that's sort of how Jetset Meds came to be. And then I just got really good feedback from my patients who they were always like, how'd you know I was going to need this? Like, how'd you know I was going to need this? And it's like, look, the same 9 prescription medications are the same medications that are prescribed over and over again at most urgent cares across the United States and as we travel into other parts of the world. So everybody has their story, and some of them, unfortunately, don't have such happy endings. And traveling obviously brings on risk, but we'll get into this a little bit. But without risk, there's no reward, right? And so our brains really, really, really feed on that. We should be taking smart risks. But part of the problem, as you and I talked about earlier before we started recording, is as technology starts making decisions for us, it becomes that much more important that we consciously make an effort to make decisions for ourselves. Otherwise, our hippocampus, which is the part of our brain that allows for decision making and creativity, shrinks down to nothing. And if we don't have our hippocampus, we have nothing. Like the Matrix, we're just plugged into the system. Allowing technology to make decisions for us is sort of the beginning of the end. And so travel, I think, really provides that unique opportunity for us to, say like, we have to go right or we have to go left. And rather than looking down at our smartphone and telling us what to do, like, just make that decision for yourself, accept that risk, as long as the outcome isn't something that's going to be extremely detrimental, but accept that risk and decide for yourself and let your instincts kind of help you, because that's how we grow our instincts. And that's sort of what the hippocampus is about. It's about instinctual feelings. It's about creativity. I always think about, there's this cool study they did like 25 years ago with London taxi drivers. And these guys knew the city of London, but they didn't go to Google Maps or Waze.
Right.
And they knew exactly how to get from point A to point B. They knew 3 different routes. They knew if there was traffic. Where they looked at these guys' brains under a functional MRI, and the hippocampus was so well developed. But ultimately, a lot of them go on to have these incredibly creative side projects when they're not driving taxis and things like that. I worked, just as an anecdote, I worked with a guy who was one of the greatest interventional cardiologists at Mount Sinai in New York City, And he drove a cab for 15 years in New York before he ended up going back to medical school and the whole nine.
Wow.
But he used to talk about how his ability to navigate the blood vessels of the heart sort of harkened back to the experience he had learning the streets of New York City
Oh, that's
as a
so
taxi.
cool. Oh my God, I love that.
Really,
I
really cool.
really, I really love your perspective on the intersection, as we just said, of travel and medicine and health, and how that experience, that personal experience with your wife, kind of led you to realize that there was a problem out there that needed to be solved, and you created that with Jetset Meds so that people can take calculated risks through travel, but also being prepared if something were to happen that, as you said, could be a trip ruiner. Could you explain what exactly Jetset Meds is so people that are
Sure.
listening are like, okay, wait, he talked about medicine and now he's talking about this. What is Jetset Meds?
Yeah. So Jetset Meds, my really, really close friend who's also a physician, he and I developed this company. And the concept is basically when we travel, you mentioned there is sort of that what if feeling, right? I mean, look, even I get that feeling like
Hmm.
we're, weeks we're going to Costa. I've literally been there over 35 times and I'm going someplace I've been before, which is not following my own advice, right? I should be going someplace I haven't been, but I've been to most places there. And so even I have a little bit of an element of anxiety. I mean, the farther we go from home, there's always a little bit of anxiety associated with that. But the whole idea with Jet Set is the vast majority of medical issues that are going to occur, swimmer's ear, foodborne illness, maybe conjunctivitis, deli belly, things like that, a sting, a bite, most of those urgent care related medical issues can be handled with 9 or 10 prescription medications. And if you have them with you, you're saving yourself that anxiety ridden trip to the local clinic. And it's not a knock against any of the local clinics. In fact, I've had some incredible experiences, which I could tell you about when I ended up having to have like 17 stitches in my head in Nicaragua. That was an interesting experience, but language barriers, the names of the medications on the side of the bottle are unrecognizable. Sometimes where those medications may or not be coming from is not necessarily the same standard that we're held to in the US. So having those medications with you, I think in and of itself provides a little bit of a stress relieving sort of property. And then we actually have through your patient portal, you have access to our US based doctor network who can answer any questions you might have while you're overseas vis-a-vis the medications in the trip. So for example, you guys are going to Machu Picchu. If someone in the team, someone in your group has a question about, we're going to altitude, what's the dose of the medicine I'm supposed to be taking? They can chat with our doctors. Then they respond via chat and say the dose is 250 milligrams of acetazolamide. Take it once per day. By the 5th day, maybe you don't need it anymore. So it's doctor backed and putting the cart before the horse a little bit as far as the medications go, so that more or less you're prepared for most of the things that are going to occur during your travels
Yeah.
from an urgent care level.
Yeah. I mean, even as you were saying that, I think about just recently last year, we had to go to urgent. I feel like I have a Google map of urgent care centers around the world. If you need to know playgrounds and urgent care centers anywhere in the world, I'm your girl. But we went somewhere and I remember texting my sister, who's a nurse practitioner, being like, hey, this really, really small island. It wasn't a Bangkok. It wasn't a Phuket, like really small island in the middle of nowhere in Thailand, prescribed this, and this at this dose. And my sister was like, we're not allowed to prescribe that in the US anymore. So like, even just having like, I know that every country has their own standards and everything like that, but even just knowing like, okay, my doctor back home has me. And you mentioned that you went from, you had 20 years of emergency medicine experience, and then you shifted more towards that concierge care and that preventative health, which I think is where I really appreciate a lot of your philosophy around health and wellness and vitality, because you don't just look at it from I know Jetset Meds is prescription medicine, but it's not just about prescribing medicine and supplements and lab tests. You really look at health from a 360-degree view and from a preventative health view. You've also created these 9 pillars of lifelong health. Could you just quickly walk us through like what each pillar is from your
Sure.
perspective, like why those are important to think about from somebody who
Yeah.
has emergency care
Yeah.
experience and then also this preventative healthcare? You have such a unique blend of acute and preventative.
Yeah. Yeah. I did a serious 180. Like
Yeah.
emergency medicine is obviously emergency medicine and trauma care is probably as far away as you can go from what I
Yes.
sort of am doing these days.
Yes.
But look, I sort of wanted that broad overview of wellness. And, Listen, 15 years in the emergency room. I trained in the South Bronx in the United States. We had the second most penetrating trauma of any county in New York State, secondary to Kings County. So for 4 summers, I was treating gunshot wounds and stabbings. One summer we had about 125 penetrating trauma between
Wow.
Memorial Day and Labor Day.
Whoa.
And so
Whoa.
we're putting chest tubes into people's lungs to reinflate lungs. And that gave me an interesting perspective. I'll be honest, I don't want to use the word PTSD, but it was like being in the military, to be quite honest. There's a lot of very devastating things happening in people's lives that we're part of every day. And I pretty much worked nights only for those 4 years. So it was 7P to 7A. And that was quite an eye-opening experience and a humbling experience. I then actually moved down. So when I was graduating my residency was when I was like, okay, all I want to do is surf for the rest of my life. So I looked for a hospital that was like as close to the ocean as physically possible. And back then on Google Earth, you could click a filter called hospital. So everything went away except for like these little red crosses. And I saw down where I am now in South Jersey, there were 2 hospitals. They were both immediately on the ocean. So I was like, okay, I got to go work down there.
I love
So I
it.
wound up in South, on the tip of the coast of in Margate, New Jersey. So I worked at Atlantic City Hospital, which, to be honest, it really wasn't quite like the penetrating trauma. And there wasn't quite so much. The humanity of what I saw in the Bronx was really something else. We didn't necessarily have that here in Atlantic City, but it was still dealing with a patient population that was really drug addicted. Fortunately, Margate, where I live, was a community where, especially during COVID, the need was there for me to go to people's homes and treat them in their homes so we could not necessarily expose, especially our elderly patients, to COVID, et cetera. And so that's what I do now. I only see patients in their home. I don't have an office. And I always loved the whole like old school medic Marcus Welby with the little bag. I have my bag, and the homes are pretty close together on the island here. So I only see patients in their home. I have a small office at home, and people, I think, really like that. I mean, it started because of COVID, but we've been able to maintain it. And it is a concierge practice. I don't love that term, but the reason I do that is because insurance companies make it very difficult for us to provide quality care. So when I was in the emergency room, I was seeing 5,500 patients a year, and now I have 125 patients, and that's it.
Wow.
So I can give all that time to that smaller patient base. And part of that is when I sit down with usually it's a couple or a patient, it's usually a 3 or 4 hour visit, the first visit. And I really try to learn everything there is to learn about not just their cholesterol level, but what do they do for a living? How long have you been married? Tell me about how you sleep at night, the whole gamut. I know when I leave a visit, if that person is quote unquote healthy or not. In fact, I could probably predict how long that person's going to live just based on that first visit, unless they make it a drastic change. And so that's sort of how these 9 pillars came to be. Was a lot of it was, I guess, somewhat anecdotal, but I was able to pull and just sort of get feedback from my patients and see how they answered my questions. And then a lot of that, to be perfectly honest, was I have a tremendous amount of respect for Dan Buettner, who wrote The Blue Zone.
Yes.
I think that's one of the best pieces of knowledge in the world of longevity and preventative health. And then if you tie that into the Harvard adult study, which was started and then it's the longest running study on human longevity. It was started in the 1930s, I think. And it's men only. So that skews the data a little bit. Unfortunately, they didn't include any women in that study, but I think they're on their 3rd or 4th research lead because the others have passed away.
Wow.
So this is a study that's been passed down through 3 different professorships at Harvard, and it's still ongoing. And what they do is, I think every other year, they send out a survey and the people fill out that survey. And then they follow those people and they're like, how old are they when they have a heart attack? How old are they when they have dementia? How long do they live to be? So it's a retrospective study, which isn't necessarily the best as opposed to a random controlled trial. But that gave us a wealth of information as well. And the intersection of that study with Dan Buettner's work, I think, is, if you look at a Venn diagram, like the intersection is not, I think, where most people expected it to be. And it was eye-opening for me. I mean, again, being an emergency medicine doctor, I never thought I would be I don't hate the word holistic because it kind of gives this, it kind of has a little bit, but the truth is, if you're not holistic, what are you doing, right? You have to be holistic. And The 9 pillars, I call them pillars because at the end of the day, if you are an A+ student in 8 of the 9, one of them you don't check the box, it's a huge problem. And what tends to happen is they go over like dominoes. They start.
Mm.
So for example, if you have the world's most perfect diet and you're exercising 4.5 hours a day, but you don't have a person in your life who loves you or who you love them, that's going to be a tremendous physiologic stress. And so you really have to check all of the 9 boxes, in my opinion, to really sort of maintain health. I think part of the other challenge is like the world we live in. Two things. It seems as though health is something that's so hard to attain, but it shouldn't be, and it's really not. And there's so many things happening in our world, whether it's diet, whether it's social media, whether it's technology, whether it's that sort of do present a little bit of a challenge. But I try to make it, I try to stress to my patients, you can do this. It's not impossible. 50, 60, 70 years ago, we didn't even have to have this
Yes, I
conversation.
was just thinking that. I was just thinking
Yeah.
that.
So unfortunately, the powers that be are making it a little bit more challenging,
Mhm.
but I do try to make sure my patients understand like this is achievable. It's easy to do. The other thing is it's a little bit hard to do is when I meet a couple, I can sort of gauge on, I like to visit with, let's say, the husband and then the wife. I bring them together because I want to see how they interact. And I guess it goes without saying to a certain degree, but like having a good marriage and that bond that occurs between a husband and a wife, there is some tremendous, like we don't know this, really don't know the science behind that. We can postulate, but it's very difficult to do a study on that, right? Like no one's going to ever be able to do a random controls trial. I mean, we could
Mhm.
always look and say these people had good, but that really goes a long, long way. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a marriage, but just having people in your life who you love and who love you back
Mhm.
is that's more important than your LDL or your LDLC. I know it, and it's a little funny for me to say that to patients. A little easier to say it on a podcast, but it's a little funny to say it to patients. But that's where those studies intersected, right? What keeps those people alive in the blue zone is the fact that their children and their grandchildren care for them, no matter how late in life it might be, right? There's no nursing homes in Okinawa. And I see that in my practice. I see elderly folks who are surrounded by their kids, surrounded by their grandkids, and they might have a 12-centimeter tumor in their lung. And on paper, they should be dead in 3 months. And then there we are 4 years later, and they're just trucking along. And it's because they're surrounded by people who love them, which gives them meaning and gives them purpose, and they have a reason to kind of hang around. And I've seen the opposite happen, unfortunately, as well.
Yeah. Hey, I recently did a poll on my Instagram where I asked you what you're looking for most in your travel experience. And the large majority of you said that you're seeking deeper experiences while you travel. In a world of AI and over tourism, we're seeking to see the world in a new way and in a way that leaves the world a better place while also transforming the way that we see ourselves. There is truly no one doing this better than And Beyond. For over 30 years, And Beyond has been curating unforgettable experiences that allow you to immerse in culture, nature, and adventure, all while keeping it luxury and unique. Nicole Robinson, the CMO of And Beyond, was actually on the podcast on episode 77, sharing how the company is redefining luxury and sustainable travel, one trip at a time. And Beyond has created and curated a collection of lodges, camps, and itineraries in some of the world's wildest places. Bucket list destinations like Africa, Asia, South America, and even Antarctica. Whether it's a private safari in Botswana or finding true peace at their stunning river lodge in Bhutan, they've got you covered. And the best part is you can travel with And Beyond no matter what stage of life or style of travel you're in. Think solo traveling, romantic getaways, family adventures, and multi-generational bonding. They handcraft bucket list experiences in a way that leaves you deeply changed and also leaves the world a better place at the same time. I mean, what more could you want out of your travel experience? Head to ambeyond.com to learn more about their lodges, camps, and itineraries and their current special offers like their anniversary or milestone celebration offer. That's www.ambeyond.com and make sure you tell them that I sent you over.
So the nine pillars are, I always say they're not in order, although obviously they are sort of in order, but I actually put interpersonal relationships first. Whether or not it deserves to be first probably could be argued, but I do put it first because if you don't have that, you have nothing. And then, 2, 3, and 4 are diet, exercise, and sleep, right? And we don't have time to necessarily get into it, but if I could sum up diet in one sentence, it would really be don't eat white sugar and don't eat white flour. That sounds so simple and so easy, but in today's world,
Yeah,
that's
it's
not
tough.
necessarily,
Mhm.
it's not an easy thing to do. I think in other parts of the world, it's probably a bit easier, but if you really look and get into it, white flour and white sugar finds its way into so many things. And what I tell folks who are sort of struggling with whether it's weight loss or there is when you go 3 or 4 or 5 days without any white flour or any white sugar, what you do is you stop the insulin peak and trough. And by stopping the insulin glucose peak and trough, you're able to like create a homeostasis with your appetite. And you'll notice you're not as hungry as you once were. And people feel fantastic. I mean,
Mhm.
skin gets better, joint pain goes away. So, diet obviously is something that we could talk about for hours and hours and hours. But like if someone said to me one sentence, no white sugar, no white flour, and then as far as exercise goes, I think we all live complicated, busy lives. So I try to just keep it super simple for my patients, right? I don't necessarily need, like, most of my guys and girls don't have time to go to the gym for an hour and a half, 6 days a week. If you do, God bless, go for it. But I would so much rather someone do 8 to 12 minutes of exercise 6 days a week for 40 years
Mhm.
than have someone who goes to the gym for 3 months, works out 2 hours a day for 3 months, and then they quit. Longevity is about longevity,
Mhm.
right? It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And if you ask too much of people and you make it inaccessible and they can't reach it, then it's a deterrent. So I always tell people like, look, all my exercise every day, I do it right here in my office. I do 40 to 60 curls with a band, 40 to 60 push-ups, 40 to 60 sit-ups. That's it. But I generally don't miss a day. And the key to exercise is just doing it and not missing a day. Sleep, the more I learn about sleep, the more I realize just how important sleep is. And it maybe deserves to be second or third on the
Yeah.
list.
Yeah.
And again, it's a little bit disturbing. I don't think this was a conversation we would have had 60 or 70 years ago. So I ask every single one of my patients, how do you sleep at night? And it is rare that the answer I get is I sleep perfectly from 11:30 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. every day. I don't have an alarm clock. I don't wake up. It's pretty rare that I get that answer. I think travel actually is a really great opportunity because a lot of people tell me like, oh, we were in St. Bart's for the week and I slept like a baby.
Mhm.
Like, okay, great. Especially if you're staying in the same time zone. And a lot of times that has to do with the fact that they're able to take whatever those racing thoughts are that's keeping them awake at night. When you physically transport yourself to another place,
Mhm.
those thoughts become a little more distant and a little farther away. And I think that oftentimes is what allows them to then get that great night's sleep. And then they need to bring that behavior back with them from travel. So I really feel like, I mean, they may be sleeping in a fantastically wonderful bed as well, or whatever it may be, or maybe the pillow worked out for them, or whatever it might be. But in the environment there, blackout shades, all those things factor in. But I often hear from patients that they were having issues with sleep. They went on a vacation and they slept like a baby, and then they can bring that back with them. So that's one of those things that I think travel really has to offer. And then stress management is a big one in today's world. This is probably the one that I know the least about. So I'm not going to get into that a whole lot, but I do have patients in my practice who do everything perfect. Like they eat perfectly, they sleep fantastically, they exercise every single day, but they have no ability to deal with stress. And we do know that stress causes release of cortisol. Cortisol is not a desirable hormone. It affects the lining of our stomach. It affects our coronary arteries. I have seen patients who had, myocardial infarctions in their 40s and 50s, and it's literally just the result of stress, psychological stress, psychosocial stress. Number 7 is preventative healthcare, right? So I have these folks who do everything right, and they think it gives them the right to not do the necessary testing that they need to do to monitor themselves, like mammograms and it's CT, low dose CT lung, looking for lung cancer, Pap smears, all these things that are colonoscopies. I mean, nobody wants to do these things. They're certainly one of the least fun things there is to do, but if you don't do them, you're not helping the cause from a longevity perspective. And then there's the other side of the coin where now there's people doing like full body MRIs.
Mhm.
There's 2 or 4 different companies out there that are offering these. I am a fan. If one of my patients comes to me and says, I'm doing full body MRI with so-and-so. I do encourage it. You do have to be a little bit careful with that because they are going to find something.
Yeah.
And if you're a person that's going to be anxious about what it is that they're going to find, you're not doing yourself any favors. I spend quite a bit of time reviewing these full body MRIs with my patients. And you have to make sure you have somebody who's going to help you through that experience, because sometimes some of these companies kind of leave you hanging a little bit. They'll say, we found so-and-so, and they put the onus on you to figure out what the next step might be. So I like the full body MRI, but you have to go in with your eyes open. And then there's like the more fun things, which I like to focus on, which is purpose, passion, travel, and meaning, right? Like these are the things that are fun. Like no one likes it when I tell them like, don't drink 7 days a week. I hate saying that and no one wants to hear it, but we can do fun things that are going to help us long-term with our health. And I think that's where travel comes in, right? So travel is probably a big one. And as we touched upon earlier, the 2 or 3 organ systems where I see travel really affecting people is the brain, right? Neurocognitively, but also from a cardiac standpoint. So there was a study done called the Framingham study. I think it was done in the 90s, and it looked at a whole array of cardiac endpoints. And one of the things and it was looking at statins, it was looking at blood pressure medicines, things like that. But one of the things that it looked at was travel. And it showed that they basically looked at 2 groups. One was a group of people who in 6 years hadn't taken what they would call a vacation. And the other group took like 2 vacations per year. And the incidence of MI was 33% lower. The incidence of heart attack was 33% lower in the group that traveled on a regular basis. So that's one of the few sort of well-done studies that really just laid it out there and said, like, you're less likely to have a heart attack if you spend some time traveling, which some people might look at that and be like, well, yeah, of course. But it was nice to see some actual scientific data. And then the other is, looking at neuroplasticity, right? And sort of as we move along through life, especially in our 30s and 40s, neuroplasticity becomes super important. And this is the concept of making sure that your brain is rewiring and that new neurons are finding new neurons inside of your brain. This is sort of part of the reason why I made the choice to leave the emergency room, was because if I had done that for another 20 years and it's the same routine over and over again, I don't think I was doing myself any favors from a neuroplasticity standpoint. And so remodeling the brain is so important, we know, for prevention of development of things like Alzheimer's and all-cause dementia. And really the truth is, dementia is like one of those, I can say to you, like, eat well, and we can work on preventing statins and different blood pressure medicines, and we can work on preventing you from having an MI. We can work on preventing you from having a stroke. But how we go about preventing dementia is much more of a challenge. There's less science out there on it. And so actually we're already seeing this aging population where their hearts are fantastic. And I see this often, that, their hearts are working fantastically, cardiovascular wise, they're doing fine. They did all their cancer prevention and cancer screening, but they have like end stage dementia and they can that for years. And so I truly believe, and there's a lot of science to back this up, that the way you keep your brain healthy and the way we avoid the road of dementia is by, just like when you want your bicep to stay in tone, you have to just continue to use the brain. And I really think travel provides that opportunity, because when we wake up and we get in the car and we go to work and then we sit, we're not challenging our brains, we're not rewiring our brains. But if we have to drive to JFK, and then from JFK we have to find that flight, and then there's a connection, and now we're lighting up all those different parts of the brain. And then I'm going to a new restaurant, I have new choices. All these different choices that we have to make are so key for neuroplasticity. There is a concept of predictive processing, which is super, super cool. It's kind of a new concept in neuroscience. And I hope I get this right, complex and a little bit out there, but predictive processing, it's not talking about necessarily like neurotransmitters and the neurochemicals like the dopamine and serotonin, although obviously those things play an important role in how our brains work. But this is the idea that our brains are constantly trying to predict the future, like a few seconds ahead, a few minutes ahead, and days ahead. And in order for our brains to be good at that skill, we need to present it with an infinite amount of different variables, right? And if we don't, if every day our eyes and our ears and our nose see the same thing, hear the same sounds, and smell the same smells, it loses the ability to predict the future because everything just becomes so routine. But if we go to Japan, where there's going to be these new foods, new people, new cultures, new languages, and then we make it through that trip, our brains are now more able to or more adept at the art of predicting the future because it's like been there, done that, right? Like Anthony Bourdain brain was him being cool as a cucumber because he had put himself in so many different situations through his travels. And a lot of people talk about how his ability as an author and a writer got exponentially better through his career because of this predictive processing, which goes back to the hippocampus because that's where our creativity centers are. And so his ability to write improved as he went to all these different countries. And to be perfectly honest, with Jetset Meds, I got thrown into this world of travel and meeting people like you and these other travel people who like take these incredible trips. And you guys probably don't see it, right? Because you're surrounded by people like this all the time. But for me, that was like very new. And I was able to kind of see how you guys think and how you process things. And it's totally the result of all these life experiences that you guys have all had. And then I've also been lucky enough to meet with some of these folks who are on social media who are like, I've been to 173 countries. I've been to 153 countries. Some of it is just like sort of a feather in the cap, but there really is a lot to be said for how they're like, if we were going to study a group of brains, those would be some interesting brains to study.
Oh my gosh.
Right. And then there's also just the fact that you do gain immunity by going to different parts of the world, right? I mean, there's a little bit of risk inherent in that. There's a microbiologic risk, of course. People do get food sickness and things like that. But when Einstein died and they studied his brain, when Bourdain died, they should have studied his gut microbiome.
Oh, yes.
He must have had antigens to all kinds of things, right?
So true.
And so it's the neurocognitive, I think, is the big one. I think traveling helps us hit a lot of the pillars. A lot of the pillars are things that are going to occur. Like people don't spend all this time and money to go someplace to sit around all day, right? So it motivates us to move, to walk around a city, to get on a bike, whatever it may be, things that we maybe wouldn't do in our everyday lives, you know, and we tend to travel with people we love, and those relationships are expounded upon during traveling. Is such a great opportunity for us to ingratiate those relationships. So many of the quote unquote pillars are things that we get to really expand upon during travel.
Yeah, I love all that. And I love that all the pillars are seemingly simple, yet like you said, you've done 7 out of the 10 correctly, but 3 of them aren't that great. The dominoes will fall. And I love that travel can really hit on all of those. I think a lot about the diet piece, where when we had gone to Greece with our retreat group from R&R, we brought people to Greece, and everyone walked away like, wow, I feel so much better eating the Greek Mediterranean diet. And it wasn't prescriptive. It wasn't like you have to eat this but people just felt great, and they ate more fish, and they had more oils, and they had less grain, and they went home and they brought that into their day-to-day life. So it's how can we integrate what we learn while we travel into all those different pillars? Or like in Costa Rica, we were all going to sleep at like 8 p.m. because the sun goes down at 6 and you're exhausted. We're going to bed at 8 p.m. and then waking up at 5:30 a.m. And even though that's really early for the normal person, we all felt fantastic because we're getting really solid sleep early on in the night and through all the way to early in the morning. So I really love all of those pieces. Just to recap that really quick, it's interpersonal relationships, diet, exercise, sleep. What was the 5th one there? I'm forgetting it.
Mental health, preventative care, and then purpose and passion.
Yes. Love it.
And then I also have to add on to there, I avoiding harmful habits is what I call it, but it's really more, you know, the pitfalls of the modern world: alcohol, tobacco, drugs. I mean, when I say the word drugs, like, you know, I have a lot, I mean, obviously I lived through the opioid epidemic as a practitioner. I've probably given 3,000 doses of Narcan in my career. I'm not exaggerating. Wow. Chemical, I like the term chemical slavery. It might be a severe sort of way of describing it, but that's exactly what it is. And we see it with benzodiazepines just as much as we do with opioids.
Mm,
Those are, again, if I have someone who eats well, they do everything right, and then they tell me, oh, and by the way, I take like 2 milligrams of Xanax every day, that's a problem.
hmm.
That's a real problem. Most people don't understand the depth of that problem, but avoiding those, I'm categorizing that as a harmful habit, but avoiding those pitfalls is also key, because we do know that people that take decades of benzodiazepines, again, it's terrible for the human brain, and there is an increase, but this is debatable. Some neuroscientists say it's not true, but I think more likely than not, you're going to be at an increased risk for early onset dementia if you're taking benzodiazepines for 20, 30, 40 years. And unfortunately, most people who take it for 2, 3, 4 years, that's it. That's the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's something that they start in their 40s, not realizing what's that going to look like when you're in your 60s, 70s, and 80s. I spend time with folks from every decade of life, and I'll ask, when did you start this medicine? Why was it started? And it's the same stories over again. So avoiding those pitfalls is important as well.
And I also think thinking harmful habits, not just from drugs, alcohol, but for me, I'm focusing a lot on my social media use, my doom scrolling with my access to news, what media I'm allowing into my life. For some people, it's gambling. For some people, it's food. For some, like it's like, where is that, and how is that causing a mental health crisis as well? So I appreciate
Totally.
that outlook 100%. I know that you've talked about health span versus lifespan, and we hear about longevity a lot. Like you just mentioned Dan Buettner. Like I would love to have a conversation with Dan Buettner. I love everything that he stands for. And that's talking about longevity, like how to get to 100 and beyond. But do we want to get to 100 and beyond if the last 20 years we're riddled with disease or can't live our life with the same level of enjoyment and quality of life? So one thing that I really love that you talk a lot about is health span versus lifespan. And I'd love for you to touch on what that means for you from an MD's perspective.
Yeah, totally. So I'm a little bit of a warning. This is going to be a little bit morbid, but I'm going to give it, I'm going to
Let's
give you
go
my
for it.
honest.
Let's go for it.
It's going to be a little bit morbid, but one of the things that I do is oftentimes I have patients of mine who are in their 40s or 50s, and they'll say, my mother or father has gotten a bit sicker. We would really love it if you could kind of help us here at this point in their lives. And oftentimes it ends up being what we call end of life care. And what happens is I'm now stepping into someone's life who maybe I didn't even know. And if they're in their, whatever it may be, sometimes they're in their late 70s, 80s, sometimes I actually just recently, I started taking care of a patient who's 98.
Wow.
I just became his doc at age 98. And so clearly these are folks who sort of are close to or potentially at the end of their journey. And I'm saying this as an example of, this may be a person who led a wonderfully healthy life, a productive life. And whatever it might be, they got diagnosed with cancer, they had an MI, they now have heart failure, sort of walking a person through what end of life care actually looks like and walking their family through what that actually looks like is kind of one of the opportunities. And to be honest, this has nothing to do with travel, but I'm just going to kind of just touch on this. It's like in this society, in our country, and in our culture, people tend to have such a fear of dying, but yet they have this reluctancy to live when they're alive. And so, for better or for worse, I've been exposed and been involved on a very intimate level in the end of so many people's lives, that it kind of has forced me to make sure that I'm constantly looking back and thinking about that. And I don't think most people at the end are going to look back and say, I'm so glad that I didn't take that trip. I have, my visits are long with my patients, hour plus most of the time. So we talk about these things very rarely towards the end of a person's health span, right? Because I have these patients who sell their businesses, they're 76 years old, and now they're ready to say, okay, I've sold my business, I want to go and travel. And it's like, well, you can't take 3 steps because you've congestive heart failure. So doing these 9 pillars, the whole idea is to not only expand upon our lifespan, but making sure that we're expanding our health span so that when we have that, whether it's a financial luxury or whether it's the luxury of time, we still have the physical ability to do things like travel and take these trips and continue to live a fruitful life. Kind of what I was getting at is, at the end, when it's the end, modern medicine, and one of the things that we're so good at is just keeping people alive, technically alive, but not living. And so I really try to make sure that when I have the opportunity to meet people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, we try to make sure that we're doing all of the things necessary so that when they're in their seventh, eighth, or ninth decade of life, they still have the independence and the energy and the freedom from a health perspective to continue living their life. And I really think travel is actually a huge part of that, because I do sort of take care of people that have financial means for the most part. They have the ability to travel from a financial standpoint, but sometimes it's just so difficult, whatever medical issue they may or may not be dealing with. Although I will say, I think Jetset has allowed some of these people to feel like they're a little bit more apt to get out there and see the world in their 70s, 80s, or even 90s. I actually have one patient who's 92, and his wife is younger, but they're on a cruise in the Amazon right now.
Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah, he's like really out there.
That's awesome.
And he's a guy who was taking care of himself for 70 years, which allowed him to get to the point where he's at now. So yeah, so health span versus lifespan comes into play oftentimes when it comes to end of life care. And Dan Buettner touches on this a little bit, but in those blue zone regions of the world, they're not keeping people alive, right? Like in nursing homes, and like we are, frankly, in America. When it's time, right? These people aren't like on life prolonging type medicines and things like that. So not only do the people in the blue zone live to be 100, but they really live. They're living while they're getting to 100, so and beyond. It is a really important distinction. It's like one of the hardest things that I have to do is kind of help walk people through end of life care, especially if that person's lifespan is continuing, but their health span has ended. That's a really difficult place to be.
You said at the start of this about health span versus lifespan that it wasn't about travel, but I think it has everything to do with it, because first off, like you mentioned right at the start, was the culture piece. And that's what we talk a lot about on this podcast is culture. There are so many cultures around the world that honor the experience that is death. Like I think of the Maori culture in New Zealand and other cultures around the world where they sit with the person who has deceased for days and honor them and celebrate them. And death is not something to be shy about. And I think that in turn, this also often in Buddhist cultures as well, I think that in turn forces those who are alive around you to reevaluate constantly the amount of life that you're living. And I think that's something that we don't do very well here in America and in other Western cultures is not have that constant reevaluation of the quality of our life. And then to go on to the piece of health span versus lifespan, I think about that all the time is I could wait until I'm, in my 50s and my 60s and my 70s to go on that trip, but I'm not going to go on the back of a 125cc motorbike and drive through the mountains of northern Thailand. Or I won't be as open to that. I'm not going to go like slide down a mountain because it's raining, and I'm not going to have the same zest for that level of adventure when I'm older. And even now with kids, I have a lot less aptitude for risk. So that is such an important role to play when we're considering what opportunities to take in our life, whether it's a business or travel or a marriage or whatever. That's going to stay with me for a really long time is your lifespan might continue on, but your health span won't. I mean, how many times do we hear, I'm going to work really hard, and then when I retire, I'm going to go travel. And it's like, well, your knees might not let you go hike in New Zealand anymore. So if you can do it, go for it. And I'm curious just to hear, what has that experience of working in end of life care given to you on your own perspective of your own life?
It really helps you put things into perspective, right? This is a little bit personal, if you will, but an example that comes to mind is, without getting into too much detail, but I had a health scare. And when I discovered this, I was with a person who didn't know me all that well. And that person was looking at my reaction to this health scare, which, by the way, thankfully, everything turned out perfectly fine. But it was like, for a short period of time, it looked like could be some very, very serious thing occurring. And this person looked at me and she said, I cannot believe how calm you were surrounding that situation. And it's like, well, I've kind of walked myself through that situation thousands of times, having had pronounced people dead many, many, many times and been there at the end. And so it wasn't so shocking to me. she just couldn't believe how sort of calm I was under that circumstance. I think I've been psychologically trained to sort of understand the fact that all of us, our days are coming, right? And God willing, it's not tomorrow. But at the end of the day, when your career and your job forces you to face that, it's sort of like at what you're alluding to these cultures where they sort of honor death. I wouldn't say that necessarily I participate in it at that level, but when it's part of your everyday life, it affects you much differently. I think it's allowed me to kind of, I don't want to say keep my cool, but it's allowed me to just sort of previously in life, in medical school, you see things and you're like, holy cow, right? So when you're in your 20s and you get exposed to these things and you're like, oh my God, it's so eye-opening. And then as the decades go on, you sort of maybe gain that wisdom at a little bit of a younger age than others might, kind of a thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about like how that would totally, like you said, put things in perspective. And it's such an interesting dynamic and duality of your own experiences in the medical field. Yeah,
Right.
it's super
Right.
fascinating.
Summertime and the living's easy, especially when you have Best Day Brewing packed in your cooler. Just because you're not drinking alcohol doesn't mean you have to miss out on creating core memories this summer. Beach time, boat days, dips in the lake, and so much more. That's where Best Day Brewing comes in. Brewed in Northern California and crafted for the doers, the trailblazers, the summertime warriors, the adventurers. Yes, that's you. Best Day creates the perfect non alcoholic beer for life's special moments. And better yet, you can earn $2 back via PayPal or Venmo when you purchase one pack of Best Day Brewing at participating retailers from now until July 30th. Check the link in the show notes for more info on the program. Cheers to your best summer yet. So, Dr. Wolk, you have traveled extensively yourself. As you mentioned, you're a big surfer. You guys love to travel. What's one place that you've been to that has completely changed your perspective on health and happiness?
Good question. So, a couple years ago, we did 6 continents in 12 months, which was a lot of fun. And one of those continents was South America. One of those continents was not Antarctica. I've never been to Antarctica. It's on my list, but we went to every other continent and we went to South America, and it was quite a journey. We ended up getting invited to a home of a pretty well-known Argentinian chef, actually, and TV personality by the name of Francis Malman. And Francis has a home on an island, and the island is on a lake, and the lake is 45 miles long, and the lake is 8 hours from the closest airport, and a 5 hour boat ride across the lake. To get to the base of the lake, you have to take an 8 hour car ride from the east coast of Argentina, completely across the desert to the base of the Andes, and then go into the Andes to then get on the boat to then go
Oh
across
my
this lake
God.
again.
Wow.
So the person who was on the island before us was a National Geographic explorer photographer who had worked for Nat Geo for 22 years. And she said it was the most remote place she had ever been. And it kind of speaks to, I always tell people, if you're getting on 2 planes to go somewhere, you're going somewhere special. And if you're getting on 3 planes to go somewhere, you're going somewhere really, really special. So this was like 3 planes, 8 hour car ride, and a really, really long boat ride, which, by the way, the first attempt across the lake, we did not make it. We see Francis putting on like head to toe, basically a dry suit, a 10 mil dry suit, because the lake water was 32 degrees. And we were just in like
Oh
regular
my
clothes.
God.
And this lake had 4 foot chop, 4 foot surf. So we did a quick U-turn and then we spent the night at the base of the lake. Then the next morning it was glass. But what was amazingly special about that we spent 5 days there was no Wi-Fi and no cell signal. I mean, to communicate with the outside world, we had a sat phone that didn't really work that well, to be honest. And the first 24 hours, so your cell phone turns into a clock and a camera. It has no other function, right? It is like 1988 all over
Right.
again. And the first 24 hours were difficult. I mean, really, it was like, it was a withdrawal period. But then by day 2, day 3, day 4, I mean, the endorphins that were being released in my brain, I hadn't felt in decades. Unfortunately, I've heard since then that he does now have Starlink. And so there is Wi-Fi at the house. But it was really an amazing life-changing experience. And it's not the same. I mean, I guess theoretically, I did find out that there are some folks that do these sort of like no tech trips,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where I guess they either take your phone or they lock it up. But like just just knowing that the phone is in like a lockbox and like if I need something or I need it, it's there is totally different than like this piece of electricity, like this piece of electronics is worthless, right? It's completely worthless. So that was like a really, really amazing experience. I mean, the food was pretty good too, not gonna lie. And there was no electricity. I mean, there was the hot water was heated by a fire, right? So the water was heated over like in a fire
Wow.
furnace. So it was pretty wild. And at the end of the day, what we did was walk, take boat rides, fish, and just talk and just get to know the people that we were with. There was 8 of us total, and it was just such an amazing experience and just such a way of like just tapping back into what our brains really are supposed to be doing every day of our lives if it's not distracted by the all-powerful smartphone. That was a pretty cool experience.
Isn't that so wild how that would have been maybe not the 3 planes and the 8-hour car ride and the 5-hour boat, but just the act of hanging out, chatting, fishing, going for a walk. That would have just been the average vacation experience just 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And now we have to go to the ends of the earth to be able to not be able to use our phones. That's how addicted we all are to it. But it really does show the inextricable link that we're now facing with the global mental health crisis and the 24/7 connectivity of the phones and social media and the news and everything like that, how much it truly plays such a role on your emotional and mental health, and then how that trickles down into your physical health. I'm sure you see that a lot, the relationship between emotional health and physical health. That's wild to me that your brain's finally like, oh, this is what regular endorphins feels like again.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I mean, look, the emotional health and physical health, you could probably argue that we are now crossing over into a time where the emotional health is becoming more powerful than physical health, right?
Mm,
Like I have people I care for who you would look at them and they look to be like a physical specimen. They eat perfectly and they work out like fiends and they are doing yoga and they're doing all these wonderful things physically for their body. But again, I have a little bit more of an inside look, whether it be through our diagnostics, through our blood work, through cardiac scans. If this is a person that's not in love with themselves, in love with their lives, and loves with the people around them, it has some profound physical effects.
wow.
And I think that unfortunately, especially in the teenage years and the early 20s, like even more so,
Mm.
you know,
I love this
during our
quote that's like, I care about more about how my life feels than rather how it looks. Like, and oftentimes
Mhm,
that has something like you can have
mhm.
the job and the status and the money and the body and the what, and the partner and the kids, but it's how do you actually feel on the inside is what's going to matter at the end of the day. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand kind of with this last question is you can plan and prepare your whole life and, have that arbitrary number in your bank account or arbitrary age that you retire at, but like you said, at an end of life care, at the end of the day, are you looking back and regretting maybe that trip you didn't take or that experience that you didn't have? And how does that make you feel at the end of your life? In terms of longevity and lifespan and health span and the 9 pillars and everything that we've spoken about today, what's one thing that travelers can do today to start using travel as a tool for better health and vitality?
This question brings me back to a concept that I would sort of categorize as like active versus passive exploring, right? So obviously, my advice would be to like get up, get off the couch, start planning, start doing. But more importantly, make sure that if you're going to take the time to go, make sure that whatever it is that you're doing is what I would characterize as active exploring. In other words, you don't have to have a guide every step of the way. Like, make sure that you, as the participant, or you and your significant other, or you and your whomever it is that you're taking this journey with, make sure that you are very much active in the decision making process, down to whether it's a little detail or a big detail. It's important for our cognitive health and it's important for our brains to be involved in the decision making process, right? Because, when you do something for the first time, like I always use surfing as an example, right? Like when you finally get the hang of it and you sort of stand up on a board for the first time, there's this huge dopamine dump and you feel wonderful about that. But if someone said to you, follow me into the water, that's the wave, that, you're going to do. It's an instructor is fine, but like you really get that real full on experience when you create it for yourself.
Mhm.
So I think it's really important to make sure that there's some active decision making and that the whole experience isn't just passive,
Yeah.
right? I mean, making sure you're in a safe situation, obviously, but I think the concept of active versus passive exploring is important for our neurocognitive health on a tremendous
I
level.
love that you just related that to brain health and cognitive health because I kind of fall into this issue a little bit with travel advising as part of my business. Of those that are
Mhm.
listening know that I'm a travel advisor, but I take a slightly different approach because I tell my clients this is a collaborative process. I'm
Mhm.
helping you whittle down your options, but it is still your option and your choice to make. And this is like, I'm going to be talking with you and we're going to have calls, and I want you to be a part of this process because it is so important to feel like you've created this for yourself with the help of somebody. Like surfing, you don't just get out there your first time and get up on a
Right.
board. You have someone helping you, but that first wave that you paddle out and catch on your own and ride even just for 1 or 2 seconds, that's going to give you so much more satisfaction than the person who's pushed you on the wave, which is there's steps to the process. And same with traveling. When you've
Totally.
navigated a complicated subway system or train system overseas all on your own without calling your travel advisor, like, wait, what platform do I go on? Like, that's a sense of satisfaction. And that's, like you said, not just this emotional satisfaction, but also from a cognitive perspective, you're setting yourself up for a lifetime of long health span. What we've been
Mhm.
talking all
Totally.
along about. I really love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to get into part 2 of this episode. For those listening, we are going to end the episode here, and you're going to listen next week to part 2, where we're actually going to be going over the very practical advice that you can take to prepare yourself for the adventure of a lifetime. And Dr. Eric Wolk will be with us every step of the way. And stay tuned for next week's episode. How special was that to have Dr. Eric Wolk on the podcast today? Imagine if we all had a doctor like him in our corners. I think the world would be a little bit better and a lot a bit healthier. But lucky for you, you can have Dr. Wolk and his team of physicians on your side as you travel with Jetset Meds. As I mentioned in the beginning, Jetset Meds is a physician-curated medical kit for global travelers, ensuring that you have access to essential, safe, and effective medications that are dosed specifically for you while you're abroad. I actually had my kit with me in Peru, and I used more than a handful of the medications and ointments in the kit. And it just felt really good knowing that I had mostly everything I needed should the common travel ailment occur. If you're interested in getting your own kit, which you should, be sure to use code TRANSFORM10 for 10% off your order. I hope you are all feeling inspired to include more travel as part of your healthy lifestyle after this episode. Stay tuned for next week's episode, which is a part 2 with Dr. Wolk, where we focus on common travel health risks, how Jetset Meds can help you feel more prepared for your adventure, and practical travel health advice that might just save your trip. All right, we'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in to the Transform with Travel podcast. If you have a friend or a loved one you were thinking of during this episode, spread a little love and share this episode with them, someone who could use a little inspiration. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe to the podcast as well. To learn more about us, head to www.transformwithtravel.co, and I'll see you on the next episode. This is your reminder to keep on exploring.